Welcome to Small Talk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of Small Talk, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Rafi Levitan, who is the author of the newly published book, Down to Earth Halachos, a practical guide to halacha for farmers and outdoorsmen. So thank you, Rafi, for joining me.
Thank you, Nachi. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
What can you tell our listeners about your book?
It's not your typical, it's a sefer, but it's not your typical sefer that you would pick up, another Hilchos Shabbos, another Hilchos Brachos. It's definitely unique. It's definitely something very out of the box. It's geared towards the halachas of outdoors and farming in Chutz La'aretz, so not for Eretz Yisrael, not for Shemitah, Trumas Meisers. But it's also, very unique that, even if you're not a farmer or you're not an outdoorsman, it's definitely a lot of topics that I cover in here that, you wouldn't really find anywhere else or anywhere discussed anywhere else.
Now, why did you decide to write this book? It's a little interesting that it's farmers and outdoors halachas. Is there a personal connection here?
Yes, that's a good question. So I grew up in Flatbush. There's not a farm or a cow or a horse anywhere anywhere nearby. I wrote it because my father has a farm upstate New York as a hobby, and my father-in-law also has a farm in New Jersey. And there's just like so many questions that always would pop up and no one would know the answer to. For example, we have an RV, a motorhome. And we first got it, it was, do you put up a mezuzah? And you call up your local Rav and, it's not, is the pot milchigs or fleishigs? So, these were questions that you couldn't just call on speed dial and get an answer to. It was always like just stumbling and, always trying to figure out who to call and who could they call that they could call to find out all these questions when you're dealing with, a guy on the farm, milking cows, Shabbos. It's not your typical question that the Rabbanim get. And they were, you asked the right person, they could do a little bit digging, but it wasn't anything that was readily available for, just open up and figure it out. So I started learning this. It took me around 5 years to write this sefer. And I was, I wanted to just make kind of a handbook for my family, for my father-in-law, for my father, and, for anyone else who, would enjoy it. Next thing you know, I have a pretty big compilation of a lot of sources and information. And, I was like, why don't I publish this? Why can't, there's plenty of Jewish farmers out there. There are plenty of people that are just interested in these topics. I think a lot of people benefit from it. So that's what I did.
Yeah, and there's quite a number of interesting topics. I think I can mention a couple, and you can pick some examples throughout because there are many in here. So the first chapter, you have Klayim, and then you break it down. Klai Behema, breeding two different animals, working two animals together. Klai Elon, grafting trees and plants. Klai Kerem, Klai Begadim, Chatnes, etc. Orla, Neter Ravai, you have Baltashches, Petar Chamar, the pidyon Petar Chamar procedure you go through. Bechar Behema Tohaira, so preventing a Bechar Behema Tohaira, handling a Bechar born with Kedusha, Shluach HaKan, Ben Pekua, Tzar Balechayim. And Tzar Balechayim is one that people might be interested in hearing about: fishing, hunting for sport. I think you obviously discussed the famous Nedi Yehuda, but I just want to mention that: eating before feeding one's animals, Cyrus castrating, shechting mother and offspring of the same day, Kisui Hadam. Then you have reciting Torah, Tefillah, and Brachos near animals and farms, owning animals, business with forbidden foods. You have foods from which is forbidden to derive benefit, non-kosher meat and foods from non-kosher animals, trading in non-kosher animals, feeding animals on Pesach, Chalav Yisrael, mezuzah, hazards on one's property, Tefillas Kalim, Dvarim Shebekdusha, Erev, Tchum Shabbos, milking animals on Shabbos, as you mentioned, and the permissible ways to keep Shabbos milk. Animals on Shabbos, so feeding animals on Shabbos and Yom Tov, helping or saving an animal on Shabbos or Yom Tov, moving animals on Shabbos and Yom Tov, walking animals on Shabbos and Yom Tov, trapping. So you have trapping domesticated house and farm animals on Shabbos and Yom Tov, practical applications of tzad, trapping dangerous and harmful animals on Shabbos and Yom Tov, the outdoors on Shabbos, so water, fire, reaping, using a tree on Shabbos and Yom Tov, tying and untying on Shabbos, building and demolishing on Shabbos, and then you have Q&A. So quite a number of interesting topics over there just to read through. So you have any particular ones you want to mention or discuss or give an example or a flavor of some of these halachas and what you do in the book for listeners?
Yeah, so the Q&As at the end is not much. Like if someone just wants the Q&As, it's maybe a page, not even. It was just something that I wanted to share it. I couldn't fit it somewhere. So I just stuck it in over there. But, every topic is specifically geared towards the outdoors and the farming. For example, in Tfilas Kalim, you're trying to think, what's the outdoors over here? But all of a sudden you start thinking, and I have all this brought down in this sefer, is, a pocket knife. If you're using a fish scaler, if you're going fishing and you use that, that clee to scale the fish, does that need to be titled? Even a fishing hook, potentially, if you think about it for half a second. I'm saying a fish doesn't need shchita, so technically when you pull it out of the water, it's ready to go and eat. Maybe you have to title that fishing hook. You don't, but a lot of those questions, just come in. So in all these topics, so it's a lot of the topics is Erev, hazards on one's property, Tfilas Kalim, and all those very basic halachos, but kind of on a farming outdoors look on it and how it would pertain to the outdoors and farming. Also, I scattered throughout. It's something that I personally enjoy when picking up, one of any book, say for like English, Hebrew, or religious, not religious, or anything like that. It's always like those do you knows like on the page. Always intrigued my interest. You open it up a book, it's very intimidating, but you could just there's a little like section like do you know? It's a little grayed out, and it just has like while I was going through all the sugyas, if anything that I was learning was like, that's actually interesting. I never heard of that, or I don't think anyone, knew that. I put it in there. For example, in Tzar Balchaim, I saw the Rambam says that the pain that a mother sees or an animal sees when their child is suffering is similar to a pain that a human mother sees when their child is suffering, which I thought was a big statement. Just going into Tzar Balchaim, you see something, you don't realize the impact that it has on an animal, and I think only the Rambam could say something like that.
Yeah, when you have like in owning animals, I'm looking. You have. Did you know it is better not to sleep in the same bed as an animal, including pets such as cats and dogs, which is interesting halacha that you put in here, and you have the makar right there. So, what are some halachas that you've come across personally that you've seen as relevant? As you said, your father and your father-in-law own farms, so you have some experience with farms. So you mentioned the RV one. Like, what about some others?
Yeah, sure. So mezuzahs on the farm is another one. If the farm needs a mezuzah, and if it does, do each stall that the animals are in, do the chicken coop need a mezuzah? Like, kind of where do you draw the line? My father-in-law had, he was, he had a chamar, and he was trying to do a pidyon petach chamar. And a lot of questions came out of there. It was born a boy, it was a bachar, but it had a mum. It was pretty much like a nafel. It died like, I think a week or 2 weeks later. Was he allowed to make a bracha or something like that? So, all that was, I already had all the answers to that. There's kind of like a little pivot. You could, if you read the lashon of the Torah while you're doing it, and the Torah brings down the full bracha, so you could basically learn the Torah and kind of squeeze in the bracha if you're trying to make it on a pidyon petach chamar that's technically you can't really make a bracha so clearly on.
Some of these halachas are, we're saying, like for a farm, but to be clear, it's not all. I mean, obviously you have, like there's a chapter on owning animals. There's one on animals on Shabbos, and many people own animals, so this is something that's relevant to those that have animals. It's not only a farm issue.
Yeah, and the same goes for trapping as well, and a lot of other categories. There's a lot of stuff in just, your everyday, you're walking down the street and your kids see the neighbor walking their dog and they want to pet it on Shabbos. What's the story over there? There's like a big misconception. If you own the animal, you could pet it, or I haven't found it. If anyone knows where that is, please let me know. There's another misconception. If an animal doesn't vocalize, then there's no tzar balachayim. Like there's no tzar balachayim on fish. I mean, I've yet to see that inside. But there's a lot of misconceptions that people, say just not knowing on, not necessarily living on the farm, just on a day-to-day life.
Right. You have some sort of regular halach as well, the outdoors on Shabbos. So one does not need to alter the schedule of a sprinkler system, so it does not operate on Shabbos. I mean, this is an issue that many people have. Many people have sprinkler systems, and you said you're from Flatbush. I don't know about in Flatbush. Many people have sprinkler systems, and so this is an issue that can come up on Shabbos, and as well as, just other general issues that relate to being outdoors on Shabbos, water, fire, and so on.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely, and also there is a little bit of an introduction before each halacha. So some, it's not necessarily right away pertaining to the farm and outdoors. So just, a basic, halachas of mezuzah. We go through the, which rooms require a mezuzah. That's not necessarily for the outdoors or on the farm. That's in anyone's house. But just, we give a quick recap of, the basic halachas before we start going into topics that pertain to the outdoors and to the farm. I try to keep it as much as possible towards the outdoors and farms, but sometimes it's not possible just to jump straight into that.
Yeah, and as you mentioned the Did You Know section, like I mentioned one, you mentioned one that was just halacha, but then you have some that are just like interesting facts. You had like in the Chalav Yisrael section, like, did you know it is believed that cheese was discovered by accident? And talk about cheese was discovered, and he says Wikipedia. You just a random little
Wikipedia. Yeah, that was a random fact. I think that's the only one that's like that. But yeah,
is that the only one? I found that one. But like it's just like I think it was nice. You just like sprinkled little interesting tidbits throughout the book. Where okay. My point is, someone could look on Wikipedia, but not necessarily. They're reading your book. They're reading a sefer. Look at halachas. Let me give you a little interesting factoid here. Jumped out at you. You thought it was interesting. You put it in.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, and it's really every few pages has it. Just something that I came across that was interesting. I could give another example. If by Tfilas Keon, this is not even necessarily for the outdoors or anything, but if one submerged the utensil by accident, it is nonetheless a valid tefillah, and one loses the opportunity to make a bracha. One does not need to have in mind that the submersion in order to fulfill the mitzvah. So basically, if you have a pot that's sitting on the ledge of the mikvah and you turn around and knock it in and it falls in, you don't get to make a bracha anymore on that, and you lost that mitzvah.
So in general, the sources used here, what are the main sources used?
So the way it's written is, the top part, like not in the footnotes, I guess the headers or whatever we call them. That's basically the very basic information. In the footnotes, I go into detail, not just bringing the Marmakamis in the footnotes. I bring a lot of additional information in English, and everything is, has a strong Marmakim. So most of them I try pulling from, the Shulchan Aruch, the Chazon Ish, Mishnah Berurah, the Aruch HaShulchan, Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, very basic, Marmakim. It's nothing. I wasn't trying to look at anything too fancy and trying to pull shilas and shuvas from anywhere. I was trying to keep it to a basic knowledge that anyone who wants to check the source. My first, what I was trying to do was just to get anyone to be able to open up a Mishnah Berurah and see it there, and pretty much confirm it. Obviously, on more complex topics and mezuzahs and Tzar B'Lechaim, I quoted a lot of the Sefer Tzar B'Lechaim and a lot of contemporary mezuzah, Hilchos Mezuzah Sorim.
Who would you say the book is meant for?
The book is really meant for anyone who has any type of interest in halacha that they've never seen brought down before. If you're a farmer, I think it's great, to do it. If you like the outdoors and you're in the bungalow colony and, it's great. But I think that anyone who just has like an interest in just like a little unique, part of halacha that's really not well known and not, no one really talks about it. And it's not your Hilchos Shabbos, as I said before. It's not Hilchos Brachos. It's really anyone who has any interest in learning, something on a different angle.
What are you trying to accomplish with this sefer?
What I'm trying to accomplish is for, farmers and anyone who's on the outdoor living in a rural area should be able to have kind of like a guide, for, if they want to do Pidyon Petach or Bachar Behemoth Tahira, even if they have cows and sheep, they should be able to just have kind of like a guidebook. Milking animals on Shabbos, feeding your animals before you eat. Just a guide for, a lot of, Jewish from farmers who either it's their livelihood or they're doing it as a hobby and they just don't know, the responsibility or, what it takes and don't necessarily ask the shilas or don't even know to ask a shilah.
So the Sefer book is available in farm stores, on Amazon, Mosaica.com, and MosaicaPress.com, that is. And I will link in the show notes. And as well, if you order through Mosaica, you can use code CHATTER for 15% off. Like always, all Mosaica books. So with that, thank you, Rafi, for joining me to discuss the book.
Thank you so much for having me, Nachi.